So we're going to meet Tamary Kudita, who is a wonderful artist and photographer, originally from Zimbabwe, but I guess that now you're living in Johannesburg, is it?
No,
Is
I'm
that
still in Zimbabwe.
you're still in Zimbabwe? Okay, great. So
Yeah.
when we made the Proud South book, we were of course blown away by the power, the dignity, the grace of your important work, which is not just about the power of the images, but also about the power of the message. And so we're very honored to have you with us today. So thank you very much, and we're truly excited to not only see your work, but also to meet you and to hear what you have to say about it so you can speak. So thank you for being here.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Philippe and Lee. I'm honored to be here to speak a little bit about my work. So I'm Tamary Kudita. I'm a fine art photographer based in Harare, Zimbabwe. I've been a photographer for about 12 years now, and you might be wondering why photography. But the simple answer is if something captivates your heart and your imagination, it's definitely something that is worth pursuing. And you'll see in my presentation, I work with a community of women in Zimbabwe. So it's always so rewarding to be able to make a difference in their lives by making them feel seen and heard through photography. So I will be presenting a quick presentation on photography and intertwined imaginaries. I use history as a point of reference. So there's going to be a little bit of a deep dive into the history of photography and how it intertwined with fashion. So I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so photography and intertwined imaginaries explores the idea of reinventing ourselves through this medium and undoing what has come before us historically. This is an overview that I created, which sums up the presentation. It's a timeline which shows how the invention of the camera contributed to a short-sighted view of Africans, and I'll also explore how the invention of the sewing machine was just as powerful as the invention of the camera. And I'll also highlight how fashion and fabric contributed to this framework. And within this unfolding, you'll see images of my work, which tend to offer a multicultural view of the African identity, which I term Afro-modernities. This is just a brief table of contents which shows the order of my presentation. So starting with the invention of the camera and colonial photography and the archive, politics of cloth and dress etiquette, and reinvention and Afro-modernities. So just to give you a brief overview of photography and what drew me to photography to begin with. So this was the invention of the camera, which was invented by Louis Daguerre, who was a French painter and a photographer, and he invented the daguerreotype process of photography, which resulted in capturing permanent images. So this idea of capturing light in its flight piqued my interest, and his quote says, "I have seized the light, I have arrested the flight." So this was a revolutionary concept at that time, and it still reigns true for me because I am quite intrigued about the idea of making something impermanent permanent, and that's a driving force behind my work. So the analog nature of photography is why I fell in love with it at university, because I am formally trained. So speaking of man and machine, I would like to introduce you to the work of Duncan Cronin. For those who don't know, he was an Irish-born South African photographer who undertook several expeditions in South Africa. And this image is amongst dozens of examples of how he weaponized the camera to drive a political agenda and introduce colonial photography. So this caption is particularly striking for me, which says, "The natives have the idea that I am trying to belittle them. I am not. My aim is to get a faithful photographic record of native life before the opportunity is lost." So this quote implied that the tribes were disappearing, which implies urgency. And that's how Africa was invented, as a scientific mystery and a people to save. So this is another example of how the African body was commodified and how Africans were viewed as currency. And this is another way of how they were framed to create a sense of urgency, and they were photographed as objects of intervention rather than people with their own agency. I would like to draw your attention to the politics of cloth, dress codes, and Afro-modernities. I'll walk you through how fabric was used to redefine identity and harness its power to change dress codes and create a cross-cultural influence, leading to the formulation of new African modernities. I think it's important to acknowledge the roots of cloth and show how continuity of designs has lived on. So this is the earliest evidence of cloth, which was discovered in Mali in the 11th century, and it's evidence of the continuity of designs over many centuries. I included this particular image just to show you the nature of cloth and how it was used to illustrate affinity between women. So this cloth is from Nigeria in West Africa, and it's a type of aso oke cloth, which was emerged as an expression of women's patronage during the 19th century, which was a period of turmoil, and it was also marked by the erosion of patrilineal authority, and women amassed profits for trading profits. So you'll notice that the symbolism, the motifs, and they symbolize the Yoruba dandan, which is a drum. So what's particularly fascinating about these cloths is that women wore these cloths to celebrate their independence, and this was post-independence. And they also used the cloth to communicate amongst themselves and embed a secret language only which they could understand as they passed the cloths between communities and communities, between their communities. So this idea of having a language which unites, which promotes solidarity was very fascinating to me. The fact that cloth can communicate so many languages through simple designs. I'd also like to draw your attention to the color indigo and how it held a significant place in Africa. So this image is a postcard of Malinke dyers who are creating a sheen type of dye that they use to embed on cloth. So this type of skill was passed down through generations of specialist dyers, and the cloth became important for many reasons, such as symbolism and status. And indigo cloth essentially became a marker of social status, with some styles being reserved for royalty or special occasions. I'd like to draw your attention to how fashion unraveled in both the West and Africa. This has been a point of interest in my work, which I will show in the latter half of the presentation. I was interested in how there was a convergence of styles. In particular, I was looking at the women's back aprons known as the ngebe, worn by the Bangetu women of Congo. So this is the image on the right-hand side of the tribes of women who are wearing back aprons, which was a form of dress etiquette. And this was in Congo. So the similarities in dress etiquette came as a result of cultural exchange during colonization, where trade routes opened up and there was a bilateral shift of dress etiquette. So the West African ngebe within its silhouette is actually believed to have influenced the Victorian bustle, which is extremely fascinating because they both emphasize the feminine figure. Furthermore, the cultural exchange led to the adaptation of European and African dress styles merged. This resulted in a fusion of European silhouettes with African embellishments. So this idea of fashion transcending boundaries and creating universalism through designs is something that I heavily draw on in my work. So Buckley notes that portraiture was a full sensual experience and emotion of getting dressed and feeling dressed up. She noted that most people's first experience of independence and most of the self-portraits infuse ideas of the past, present, and self. So the idea that the sewing machine allowed women to yield power and upend fashion systems was driven by colonial powers. The camera, then followed in the right hands, became a place for invention, and the sewing machine became an economy that was largely powered by women. So Catherine McKinley also notes that sewing machines arrived in Africa around the same time as the camera, which were means of economic power. In this slide, I compiled 3 images just to show you the evolution of the sewing machine and how it initially started. So on the left-hand side, we have a weaver who is sitting in a pit, and he is using his feet as pedals to which is the way of how they were making the fabric. And then in the center, we have a Yoruba lady who's weaving fabric on a vertical single-headed loom, which was a technique known for hand-woven hairstyles. And on the right-hand side, this is a present-day image of my designer, Angeline Dlamini. She is the lady who creates the designs that you're going to see in the following images. We work hand in hand. We've been working together since 2019, and even all the images that were compiled in the Proud South book, they were all created by Angeline Dlamini. So this is the final chapter where I'll just speak about my work. This was my series titled African Victorian, The Genesis. I wanted to create Afro-modernities, which refers to an intersection of cultures. So my work offers a multicultural view of the African identity. So this very first image I created in my series was inspired by the notion of the African identity and how it's heavily layered and it's very complex. So unlike the way the camera was used to weaponize African women in the beginning of the presentation, I wanted to use the camera as a tool for emancipation, and bring light to a new generation of empowered women, and also illuminate people's histories which were rendered invisible, and essentially create a future-facing image of the African woman. These are some more images from my work. The one on the left-hand side is entitled Body as Archive, and the one on the right-hand side is entitled Victorian Armor. So in these pieces, I wanted to look at the idea of the dress as a fortress and how women used it to armor themselves against ideals of a patriarchal society. So these images were playing with the idea of what an armored woman would look like. So the hairstyles I incorporate in my work were inspired by the Fante women of Ghana. These hairstyles were particularly fascinating and important because the hairstyles mimicked the architecture that was happening at that time. And it's interesting to see how in the United Kingdom and in Ghana, these kind of ancient hairstyles are still being practiced today in the modern day. So this was my inspiration behind the hairstyles, and they mimicked pineapples. And I think the connection between architecture and hair is very fascinating. So this is one of my other images titled African Pot. I'm often asked by viewers of my work where I meet my models, and I meet them in the most random of places. For example, I met this lady, her name is Gladys. I met her at a grocery store, and she works as a trolley pusher. So I was inspired by wanting to use photography to speak about the unsung heroes in our community. So when I engaged in conversation with Gladys, she reveals to me how she is the backbone of the family and she's the breadwinner of the family. So I wanted to create an image which pays tribute and honors her story. So I took the idea of her apron. She wears an apron, and then I inverted the idea of an apron to create a regal African-inspired Victorian dress. So that's the dress that you see in the right-hand side where I'm fitting, and then this is the final image. So the idea of the African pot, it's a symbol in African culture for storing water. So I wanted to highlight the resourcefulness of vessels and the beauty of human creation. So the image is a blend of boundaries of tradition, anthropology, and beauty. So Zimbabwe is defined by mobility and mixing. So this image was created in order to reclaim spaces where we were denied access to previously. So I thought it was quite powerful to bring the idea of the African woman, and now she's in the present day and she's reclaiming the spaces. So it blends anthropology with contemporary ways of practicing. So this dress that she's wearing, it's a merge of cultures. Zimbabwe was formerly a British colony. So the idea reinvents the past and the present and borrows from contemporary and historical silhouettes to create a new visual language. And on the right-hand side, we have a man who's taking a selfie with the model. And I thought this was particularly fascinating because art is typically confined to certain spaces. So this showed me that when art is taken into the public space, it becomes a universal language which anyone can relate to. And it shows that photography essentially exists beyond the frame. You see the picture, the current picture, but then you see the behind the scenes of how art is a community. So I included this image to see just a casual snapshot of what happens in these communities when we have these photo shoots in public spaces. So these are 3 images from my African Victorian series. All of them tell a story of tradition and triumph. So the lady on the right-hand side with the black dress, she's holding Shona utensils on her head. And then in the middle, we have Vessel, where she has a ship on her head. And then on the right-hand side, we have a lady who's holding corn. So all these symbols invert the stereotypical image of a woman, an African woman holding a bucket on her head. So I wanted to complicate this kind of narrative and show how culture can be supported by a community of women. So they're holding symbols of culture on their heads. And I think it's a profound way of blending national pride with contemporary ways of practicing. And you'll see also their dresses, which my designer makes, they're a way of draping them in dignity. So this is another one of my image. It was taken in an urban landscape. The location doesn't exist anymore because they're now buildings. They modernized the entire field. So it was taken in 2020, and it's entitled That Evening Sun Goes Down because that's the ideal time women gather around to cook for their family. So they are cooking mealie, which is a staple food in Zimbabwe. So in this image, I wanted to idealize the everyday and place great importance on cooking, which seems mundane, but I wanted to emphasize the monumental nature of everyday acts because these acts bring women together in solidarity. So the dress also plays with notions of a ceremonial dress and ceremonial attire that's been reinvented and reimagined. So these are the symbols of culture which appear in my work. I think they are particularly important as a way of grounding my work that's very much rooted in culture and our heritage. So the hari, the vessel that is on the right-hand side, is known for storing water. And then we have the sweeper on the bottom right-hand side, which is a sweeper for sweeping houses. I'm sure you're all familiar. And then the surrealist-like objects are actually objects which are used for fetching beer, and some of them are used as musical instruments. So I think incorporating these elements adds a layer of complexity to the images that you see. So you're not just seeing a woman who's draped in a dress, but you also see the cultural objects which complicate the narrative and give a different reading. So this image was, it's also part of my African Victorian series. So the idea behind this image, it was inspired by an African proverb, which says, it takes a village to raise a child. In this image, I reinvented that saying and I said, it takes an army of women to change how we are represented in the visual canon of art. So furthermore, you'll notice that the women are mirroring each other and standing together in solidarity. And there are also notions of traditional family gatherings where stories are often exchanged. So this was also looking at that idea of gathering. And when you have family gatherings, you often exchange conversations about who looks like someone else, who looks like someone else. So I think this idea of carrying oral tradition and portraying oral tradition in photography is a way of creating a new sense of identity formation. And it's essentially freedom. And I use photography to give birth to a new generation of essentially empowered women. So this brings me to the last slide of my presentation. And speaking of empowered women, this image titled Liberty 1980, it was titled after the year Zimbabwe got its independence, which was in 1980. So this image was a tribute to Zimbabwe female war veterans who were essentially written out of history. So there were war veterans who fought alongside their male counterparts in the Second Chimurenga War, but they were written out of history. So I decided to use photography as a vehicle to allow these women to assert their rightful place in history and say, we have a voice, we have a story that extends beyond these pages. So I think that's the beauty of using photography to bring things alive. This lady, her name is Rosebud. She works as a makeup artist, but in this image, she assumes a new identity. So I think that's the power of photography and fashion as well. She's riding a horse, she's wearing a dress, she's wearing feminine pumps. And I think this shows that women can do it all. And that was the message. So I hope from this presentation, you'll see how photography empowers us to assert our own agency and create our own worlds. And you can see the power of how the camera and the sewing machine, when they come together, they can shape our contemporary realities and making the world a place that is more meaningful. So thank you.
Wow.
Wow, this is amazing. Masterclass, as says Philip.
You're a masterclass.
It's
Thank you.
super inspiring. It's super well studied. It's very nice to have the context of this all. So it's not only that you gift us with these amazing pictures, because I know there's many more of these portraits of the females on horses. It's like incredible. And thank you that you have been, wanting to be in my book. It's a real honor, and I'm so happy to meet you and to learn more about your work. We want you to come and speak to our students soon, I think.
Yeah.
That would be amazing. Thank you. I'm so excited for the book that you're launching next.
Yeah, I'll show us a little lift, a little curtain, but it's on the printer right now. So we are going to launch in Milan.
Oh,
Very
amazing.
inspiring, super nice. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so much. Thank you.